The call of duty and the weight of sacrifice. The silent battlefield. The cold desert wind howled through the gaps in the military outpost's flimsy walls, carrying the scent of dust, oil, and distant gunfire. Captain Ethan Carter stood near the edge of the encampment, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The desert night was creeping in, swallowing the remains of another long day in the war zone. He was alone, watching, waiting. His unit, his brothers, gathered around a dimly lit fire behind him. Their laughter subdued but present. They were tired, all of them, but some still found the strength to joke, to pretend that the darkness surrounding them didn't weigh down on their shoulders like an iron shroud. Ethan had once been like them, full of reckless confidence, unshaken by the chaos of war. Now, after 3 deployments, he felt hollow. The young soldier who had left his small-town home in Texas full of dreams and ambition was a ghost. War had a way of stripping a man of his illusions, of reducing him to something raw and unrecognizable. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the well-worn letter folded neatly inside. His wife, Sarah, had sent it weeks ago. He had read it so many times that the paper was creased, the ink smudged in places where his fingers had lingered. Yet every time he unfolded it, he felt the same surge of fear, hope, and uncertainty. "Ethan, I wanted to tell you in person, but I couldn't wait any longer. We're having a baby. A little boy or girl. I don't know yet, but I want you to be here. I need you home. We both do. A baby. His baby." The thought had terrified him then. It terrified him now. How could a man who had spent years in the trenches of war, who had seen the worst of humanity, be expected to nurture something as fragile as a child? How could he teach his son or daughter about love when he had lived in a world of violence for so long? "Captain." A voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Lieutenant Ramirez standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Ramirez was a good man, strong, reliable, the kind of soldier Ethan trusted with his life. "We leave at dawn," Ramirez reminded him. "One last patrol before we're wheels up." Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening around the letter before he slid it back into his pocket. "Understood. Tomorrow, one last mission. Then he could go home. Or at least, that's what he thought. The mission that changed everything. They moved under the cover of darkness. The desert stretched out before them, an endless sea of shifting sand and unseen dangers. Their convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, headlights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. It was supposed to be routine, a final sweep before heading back to base. Routine. Ethan had learned long ago that there was no such thing in war. The first explosion shattered the silence. The blast sent their lead vehicle into the air like a toy, flipping it over before it crashed down in a fiery wreck. Shouts filled the radio. Gunfire erupted from the dunes, shadows shifting in the moonlight as enemy combatants emerged from their hiding spots. Ambush. Cover fire. Ethan barely had time to process before instinct took over. He threw open the door of his vehicle, diving for cover as bullets ricocheted off the armored plating. The sharp metallic scent of blood and smoke filled his nostrils. "Carter, on your 6. He spun just in time to see Ramirez go down, a shot ripping through his shoulder. Without hesitation, Ethan sprinted toward him, ignoring the sting of shrapnel slicing into his arm. "I've got you." He dragged Ramirez behind cover, pressing his hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. The younger man gasped in pain, his fingers digging into Ethan's sleeve. "Leave me," Ramirez started, but Ethan cut him off. "Shut up and stay alive." More gunfire, more chaos. Ethan's unit fought with everything they had, holding the line against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. Time blurred. The desert night became a battleground painted with fire and death. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack was over. The enemy retreated into the darkness, leaving behind bodies, both theirs and Ethan's men. Silence settled over the battlefield, heavier than the weight of his gear. "We lost 3, someone whispered. 3 good men, 3 families that would never see their sons again. Ethan felt something inside him crack. He had survived. Again. But at what cost? The flight home. He sat in silence on the military transport, staring at the dried blood on his hands. It wasn't his. It rarely ever was. Ramirez had survived, but others hadn't been so lucky. Ethan closed his eyes, but the memories of the ambush replayed behind his eyelids in stark, unrelenting detail. The smell of burnt metal, the sound of screaming, the feeling of another man's blood soaking into his uniform. "We're going home, Captain," a voice said beside him. He opened his eyes. Sergeant Daniels, his second in command, gave him a small smile. "Home," Ethan echoed. The word felt foreign. Home wasn't war. Home wasn't chaos. Home was Sarah. Home was his unborn child. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he didn't recognize. Fear, not of battle, not of death, but of the unknown. He had trained for war. He had spent years perfecting the art of survival, but he didn't know how to be a father. And that terrified him more than anything. The reunion. The airport was crowded, the air thick with the scent of coffee and the sound of rushed footsteps. Ethan stepped off the plane, his duffel slung over his shoulder. His uniform was neat, but he felt out of place, like a ghost in a world that had moved on without him. Then he saw her. Sarah. She stood near the terminal entrance, her hands resting on her swollen belly. Her golden brown hair was tied back, her eyes scanning the crowd with desperate anticipation. When their eyes met, something inside him shifted. She ran to him, and he dropped his bag just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. Her body was warm, familiar, grounding him in a way nothing else had. "You're home," she whispered against his chest. "I'm home," he murmured. For the first time since leaving, he allowed himself to believe it. But as he held her close, as he felt the new life growing inside her, a dark voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Are you ready for this?" Because Ethan Carter had survived war. But was he strong enough to survive being a father? Home is another battlefield. The weight of war at home. Ethan Carter stood in the middle of their small living room, gripping the straps of his duffel bag so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was home. He should have felt relieved, at peace, but instead, he felt like an intruder. Everything was the same. The scent of lavender from Sarah's favorite candles filled the air. The soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen buzzed just as he remembered. Yet, everything felt different. Or maybe he was the one who had changed. Sarah moved around him cautiously, as if afraid to shatter the moment. She had imagined this day 1,000 times, dreamed of the moment Ethan would walk through the door and take her into his arms. And yet now that he was here, he seemed distant. His uniform was clean, his boots polished, but his eyes were haunted. "You okay?" she asked gently, placing a hand on his arm. Ethan nodded stiffly. "Yeah, just tired." That was a lie. He wasn't tired. He was overwhelmed. The silence of home was deafening compared to the battlefield. The absence of gunfire, of orders shouted over radio static, it left a hollow space in his chest. "Come sit," Sarah said, guiding him toward the couch. He obeyed, feeling as though he were following orders again. She sat beside him, her belly round and full with the life they had created. She reached for his hand, placing it gently against her stomach. "He kicks a lot now," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard as he felt a small but distinct movement beneath his palm. It was surreal. He had faced death 100 times over, but this, the simple act of feeling his child move, terrified him in a way he couldn't explain. "It's real now, isn't it?" Sarah murmured, watching his face. Ethan forced a smile, but the knot in his chest tightened. "Yeah, it's real." But was he ready for it? The first night back. The nightmares came that night. Ethan had managed to sleep for only an hour before the past came clawing into his dreams. He was back in the desert, The sandstorm howled. Bullets cut through the air. The heat of an explosion scorched his skin. He heard Ramirez's voice screaming his name. And then, silence. The silence was worse than the gunfire. It was the silence of the dead. Ethan woke up gasping, his heart slamming against his ribs. His breath was ragged, his body drenched in sweat. His hands trembled as he pushed himself upright. Sarah stirred beside him. Ethan. Her voice was laced with sleep and worry. He turned away from her, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "Just need some air," he muttered. Sarah sat up, watching his rigid back. She wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, but she knew better. She had read enough, heard enough from other military wives to know that sometimes the battle didn't end when they came home. Ethan stood and left the room, stepping out onto the back porch. The cool night air did little to calm his racing heart. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his fingers grazing over an old scar on his scalp. A reminder of a mission gone wrong. The stars above were bright, clear, so much like the stars he had seen from his outpost overseas. But here, they felt different. Here, they felt distant. Struggles of a returning soldier. The days passed, and Ethan tried to adjust. He tried to slip back into the routine of civilian life, to be the man Sarah needed, the father their child deserved. But it wasn't easy. The grocery store was too crowded, the lights too bright. The sound of a car backfiring sent his heart into his throat. The whispers from neighbors, the lingering stares, they all made him feel like a stranger in his own town. He had expected to come home and feel whole again. Instead, he felt fractured. Sarah did everything she could to help. She cooked his favorite meals, played the music he used to love, tried to make their home feel familiar again. But no matter how much love she poured into the space around him, Ethan still felt lost. "You don't have to do this alone," she told him one evening as they sat on the couch, her fingers tracing circles on his hand. Ethan exhaled. "I don't know how to talk about it, Sarah. I don't even know where to start." She squeezed his hand. "Then don't start with words. Just let me be here. Let me in." He wanted to. He wanted to tell her about the nightmares, about the weight of guilt he carried for the men who hadn't made it home. But the words felt stuck in his throat. "I'll try," was all he could manage. A test of patience. As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed something else. Ethan never spoke about the baby. He helped with small things. He built the crib. He nodded when she talked about names, but there was a hesitation in him. One afternoon, as Sarah folded baby clothes, she decided to ask, "Are you excited?" Ethan looked up from the chair where he sat. "For what?" Sarah gave him a small smile. "For the baby." Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, of course." That didn't sound very convincing. Sarah said gently. Ethan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's not that I'm not excited. It's just, I don't know how to do this, Sarah." Sarah set the clothes down and walked over to him, kneeling beside his chair. "Neither do I," she admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." He looked at her, really looked at her. She was tired, just as tired as he was. But there was love in her eyes. "I want to be a good father," he whispered. Sarah smiled softly. "Then you already are." For the first time in weeks, Ethan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be. A moment of clarity. One evening, Ethan sat in the nursery, staring at the half-painted walls. A stuffed bear sat in the corner, and a tiny mobile hung above the crib. A life was about to begin here, a life that was his responsibility. Sarah walked in quietly, watching him. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. Ethan exhaled. "I used to think war was the hardest thing I'd ever do. But now I think this, being a father, might be even harder." Sarah smiled, leaning against the doorway. "Maybe," she said. "But I know you, Ethan. You never back down from a fight." Ethan chuckled dryly. "This isn't a fight, Sarah." "No, She raised an eyebrow. Then what is it? He looked at her, his heart full of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It's a chance, he said. Sarah nodded, stepping forward and placing his hand on her belly. Then take it. Ethan felt another small kick beneath his palm, and for the first time, he smiled. Maybe he was ready for this, or maybe he never would be. But either way, he was home. And that was a start. The unseen wounds of war. A soldier's ghosts. Ethan Carter had spent years in war zones, dodging bullets, leading men into battle, and making decisions that meant life or death. But war was simple. War had rules. Life back home, however, was unpredictable and unforgiving in ways he hadn't expected. Some battles were loud, with explosions and the screams of comrades. But the worst battles were silent. They waged themselves inside his mind, creeping into his bones when the house was too quiet, when Sarah's voice was distant, when the baby's crib sat empty, waiting. He should have felt safe here, in this house, with the woman he loved and their unborn child. But instead, he felt like a foreigner in his own life. Nights were the hardest. Each time, Ethan closed his eyes. He was back there. The roar of an explosion. The metallic scent of blood. The screams of a wounded man, Ramirez, calling for him, needing him. The acrid smoke choking his lungs. And then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in gasps. Sarah stirred beside him, groggy but worried. Another one, she asked softly. Ethan ran a hand over his face, trying to steady his breathing. Yeah, talk to me. I can't. She sat up, rubbing his back in slow circles. You don't have to do this alone, Ethan. You're not at war anymore. But that was the thing, he was. The war never really left. It followed him, clung to him like a second skin. He sighed, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. I just need some air. Sarah watched as he left the room, walking toward the backyard, the cool night air wrapping around him. She wanted to help, but she knew he had to fight this battle on his own. She just prayed he wouldn't lose. Trying to adjust. Ethan spent his days helping around the house, trying to settle into normalcy, but even the simplest things felt foreign. The grocery store overwhelmed him. The bright lights, the endless choices, the people moving too fast, too close. He hated the way his body tensed every time someone walked behind him. He knew it was irrational, but the instinct to always watch his six was impossible to turn off. He hated how restless he felt, how every noise, every car backfiring, every loud voice set his heart racing. Most of all, he hated feeling like he didn't belong in his own life. Sarah noticed it. She saw the way his hands clenched into fists when they went out in public, the way his jaw tightened when the neighbors asked about his time overseas. He was holding it all inside, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he exploded. A breaking point. One afternoon, Ethan was fixing a leaky pipe under the sink when Sarah walked in, rubbing her belly. The baby's kicking a lot today, she said with a smile. Ethan grunted in response, too focused on tightening a bolt. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. Ethan, can we talk? He wiped his hands on a rag, standing up. What's wrong? You're shutting me out, she said gently. I know this transition isn't easy, but you don't have to go through it alone. Ethan tensed. I'm fine, Sarah. You're not. His jaw clenched. You don't understand what it's like. You don't know what I saw, what I did. You don't know what it's like to wake up every night feeling like you're still there. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. No, I don't. But I know what it's like to love someone who's breaking and not be able to reach them. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, Sarah whispered, I need you, Ethan. Not just physically. I need you to come back to me. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He knew she was right. He just didn't know how to fix himself. I'm trying, he admitted. Sarah stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. "Then let me help you." For the first time, Ethan let himself lean into her embrace. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do this alone. A new kind of battle. Ethan started therapy a week later. It wasn't easy. Talking about the war, about the men he lost, about the guilt, none of it came naturally. But the therapist was patient. She didn't push him, didn't force him to talk before he was ready. Survivor's guilt is common, she told him during their third session. You lost men. You made decisions that cost lives. But you also saved lives. Do you ever think about that? Ethan shook his head. No, I just think about the ones I couldn't save. The therapist nodded. That's the burden of leadership. But you have to let yourself grieve without carrying all the blame. Ethan wasn't sure if that was possible. But for Sarah, for the baby, he had to try. The baby's arrival. It happened in the middle of the night. Sarah's hand gripped Ethan's arm like a vice. "Ethan," she gasped. "It's time." His heart slammed against his ribs. This was happening. This was real. He scrambled to grab the hospital bag, his training taking over. Every step felt like a mission. Get her to the car. Drive safely but quickly. Stay focused. But when they reached the hospital, everything changed. Suddenly, he was powerless. He could only watch as doctors rushed around, Sarah gripping his hand so tightly he thought she might break his fingers. "You're doing great, baby," he whispered, brushing damp hair from her face. She gave him a tired smile. "I'm scared." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Me too." The hours passed in a blur. Then, at 4:17 a.m., he heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A cry. A tiny, perfect cry. The doctor smiled. "Congratulations, Dad. You have a healthy baby girl." Ethan felt his knees go weak. A girl. He turned to Sarah, who was crying softly. "She's here," she whispered. Ethan looked down at the tiny pink bundle the nurse placed in Sarah's arms. She was so small, so delicate, and she was his. Tears burned in his eyes as he reached out, his fingers barely brushing against his daughter's soft cheek. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm your dad." Sarah smiled through her exhaustion. "Hold her, Ethan." He hesitated. "What if I drop her?" Sarah laughed weakly. "You won't." With careful hands, Ethan lifted his daughter into his arms. She felt weightless, fragile, a stark contrast to the heavy rifle he had carried for years. And yet, in this moment, she was the most important thing he had ever held. She blinked up at him, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb. And just like that, Ethan Carter, soldier, survivor, broken man, felt whole again. "I've got you," he whispered. "I promise." And for the first time, he believed it. A fragile peace. A new war begins. Ethan Carter had survived war zones, gunfights, and ambushes, but nothing could have prepared him for the sleepless nights, the endless cycle of diapers, and the overwhelming love he felt every time he looked at his daughter. For the first few weeks after Amelia's birth, time became a blur. The world outside didn't exist, just the small bubble of their home, where exhaustion and love mixed in equal measure. Sarah was incredible. Despite her own exhaustion, she nurtured Amelia with a patience that left Ethan in awe. He helped where he could, rocking the baby when she cried, making bottles, running errands, but there was something distant about the way he moved through it all. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't that he didn't love his daughter. If anything, the love he felt was terrifying in its intensity. But something still felt off. He was here, physically, but emotionally. He wasn't sure he had come home yet. The way to fatherhood. One night, Ethan found himself alone in the nursery. Sarah was asleep, catching much-needed rest, and Amelia had finally settled in her crib after hours of fussing. Ethan sat in the rocking chair, watching her sleep. She was so small, so peaceful. Her tiny chest rose and fell in rhythmic breaths, her fingers curled into delicate fists. She had Sarah's nose, but everything else, her dark hair, the sharpness of her tiny jaw, was his. "I don't deserve you," Ethan murmured. His words felt like a confession to a sleeping audience. What kind of father was he going to be? The ghosts of war still whispered in his mind, their voices heavy with doubt. He had spent years being trained to destroy, to survive. But what did he know about building a life? About raising a child? What if he failed her? What if one day she looked at him and saw what he saw in himself? A man too broken to be whole. Amelia stirred, her tiny lips parting in a soft sigh. Ethan reached out, brushing a fingertip against her cheek. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he whispered, "but I'll try. I swear to you, I'll try." Cracks in the armor. Sarah could see it, the way Ethan tried so hard to be present, yet something held him back. He loved Amelia. That much was obvious. But there were moments where he seemed lost in his own mind, trapped in a place Sarah couldn't reach. She found him in the nursery again, staring at Amelia in silence. "Ethan," she said gently, stepping inside. He turned, his expression unreadable. "She's perfect." "She is." Sarah walked closer, watching as he ran a hand over his face. "But I'm not," he admitted. "I don't know how to do this, Sarah. I don't know how to be the father she deserves." Her heart ached for him. "You don't have to be perfect, Ethan," she said, taking his hand. "You just have to be here. You have to love her. And you do." "What if I mess up?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Then we figure it out together." Ethan exhaled sharply, nodding. He wanted to believe her, but some wounds ran too deep to heal overnight. The ward he couldn't escape. Ethan tried. He really did. But the nightmares didn't stop. The sound of Amelia crying would wake him in the night, and for a split second, his mind would pull him back into the war. The echo of a wounded soldier screaming. The deafening explosion of an IED. The scent of burning flesh. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. Sarah would be there, whispering that he was safe, that he was home. But was he? Some nights, he would sit outside, smoking a cigarette he never intended to finish, staring up at the stars. Home was supposed to feel different, but he still felt like a soldier living between battles. And no matter how much Sarah reassured him, a dark voice in the back of his mind whispered, "You don't belong here." Pushed too far. It happened on an ordinary day. Ethan had gone to the grocery store, something that should have been simple. But the aisles were too crowded, the noise too loud. His heart pounded as people brushed past him, as a shopping cart banged against metal shelves. And then, a loud crash. The sound of something falling, shattering. Ethan's body reacted before his mind did. His breath hitched, his muscles tensed, his vision tunneled. "Get down." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. But there was no enemy, no explosion, just a mother and her child staring at him in shock after knocking over a stack of canned goods. Ethan's chest heaved as reality snapped back into place. He wasn't in a war zone. He was in a grocery store. People were staring. Sarah was staring. Her hand was on his arm, grounding him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, it's okay." But it wasn't. Not anymore. Breaking point. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, his head in his hands. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him. "Talk to me," she pleaded. "I don't know how," he admitted. She knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Then just listen." Ethan met her eyes, raw and desperate. "You are not alone in this," she said. "I know you think you have to fight this battle on your own, but you don't. I am here, Ethan. Amelia is here, but we can't help you if you don't let us." His throat tightened. "I don't know how to be normal, Sarah." She smiled sadly. "Then don't be normal. Just be you. Be here. That's all we need." Ethan closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. Sarah cupped his cheek. "Then fight for us. Let us in." For the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to stop fighting alone. A soldier's guilt. Ethan sat in the nursery long after Sarah had gone back to bed. The dim glow of the nightlight bathed the room in soft gold, casting long shadows along the walls. Amelia stirred in her crib, making tiny noises in her sleep. She was so small, so helpless. His daughter. His mind wandered back to the battlefield. The bodies, the smell of burning sand, the sounds of his men gasping for air, whispering their final words. "Tell my mom I love her. Promise me, Captain, get home for us." But they never made it home. And yet here he was, alive, breathing, holding his daughter. "Why me?" he whispered to the quiet room. Why did he get to have this life, while so many never made it back? Why did he get a second chance, when men better than him had died screaming in the sand? A lump formed in his throat as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn dog tag of a fallen friend. Sergeant Davis. He had been 26, newly married, a father-to-be. And now, buried 6 feet under. Ethan clenched his fist around the tag, his body trembling. "You should be here, man." The guilt felt suffocating. He had cheated death too many times. And now, instead of being grateful, all he could feel was the crushing weight of knowing that others weren't as lucky. Pushing Sarah away. The next morning, Ethan barely spoke. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked as they sat at the kitchen table, Amelia asleep in her bassinet nearby. Ethan stared at his coffee, his jaw tight. "I'm fine." Sarah sighed. "No, you're not." His grip on the mug tightened. "You don't get it, Sarah. You never will." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. Hurt flickered across her face, but she refused to back down. "Then help me understand," she pleaded. Ethan exhaled sharply, pushing his chair back and standing. I need some space." Sarah's heart clenched. "Space," she repeated. He nodded, running a hand over his face. "Just a little. I need to clear my head." She swallowed hard. "Are you running away, or are you trying to fix this?" Ethan paused. He didn't have an answer. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. The long walk. Ethan walked aimlessly through town, his hands shoved into his pockets. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke. People passed him by. Mothers pushing strollers, kids laughing on bicycles, old men sitting on benches, enjoying the morning sun. He envied them, the simplicity of their lives. He wasn't built for this kind of peace. His hands had spent years holding rifles, not baby bottles. He was used to taking orders, making split-second decisions, not choosing between baby cribs and lullabies. Deep down, he wondered, did he even deserve this life? A conversation with an old friend. His feet carried him to a familiar place, the Veterans Center, a small, nondescript building where men like him gathered. He didn't know why he came. Maybe he just needed to be around people who understood. Inside, he found an old friend, Jackson, a fellow soldier, a man who had seen the same hell Ethan had. "Carter," Jackson greeted, sipping his coffee. "Haven't seen you in a while." Ethan sat down beside him. "Yeah, been busy." Jackson gave him a knowing look. That code for struggling. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Something like that." Jackson leaned back. "I get it, man. Home feels different, doesn't it? Quiet. Too damn quiet." Ethan nodded. "I keep waiting for something bad to happen. Like I don't deserve this life." Jackson was silent for a long moment before finally saying, "We all feel that way, Carter, but that doesn't mean we don't deserve to be happy." Ethan swallowed hard. "What if I mess it up?" Jackson smirked. "Then you fix it. You spent years fighting for survival. Now you fight for something else. Your family." Ethan let those words sink in. You ever feel like the war doesn't leave you? Jackson sighed. Every damn day. But at some point, you gotta decide if you're gonna keep living in it, or if you're gonna let yourself move on. Ethan looked down at his hands. Maybe that was the real war now. Learning how to move on. Coming home. For real this time. By the time Ethan returned home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of purple and gold. He stepped through the front door, expecting to find Sarah angry. Instead, she was in the nursery, holding Amelia, humming softly. The sight hit him harder than any bullet ever had. Sarah glanced up when she saw him. "Hey," she said softly. Ethan stepped forward, hesitating. "I'm sorry I walked out." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "I know this isn't easy for you, but Ethan, you can't just disappear when things get hard." He swallowed, nodding. "I know. I don't know how to be the man I was before." Sarah's eyes softened. "Maybe you don't have to be. Maybe you just need to be the man you are now." She gestured for him to sit beside her, placing Amelia in his arms. Ethan held his daughter close, feeling the warmth of her tiny body against his chest. "She needs you," Sarah whispered. Ethan looked down at Amelia, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb. "And I need her," he admitted. For the first time, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. Maybe Jackson was right. Maybe it was time to stop living in the war and start living for something more. Learning to be whole again. A father's resolve. Ethan Carter sat on the nursery floor, cradling his daughter in his arms. The soft glow of the nightlight painted the room in warm hues, casting gentle shadows along the walls. Amelia's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, her breathing steady and rhythmic, as she slept against his chest. She was so small, so innocent, and she had no idea how broken her father was. Ethan had spent his whole life being strong. First as a boy raised by a military father who believed that emotions were weaknesses, then as a soldier who had been trained to survive at all costs. But nothing had prepared him for this. For the quiet. For the fear of messing up. For the weight of fatherhood pressing down on him like a rucksack filled with bricks. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered to the sleeping infant. "But I swear to you, I'll try." A soft creak from the door made him look up. Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're already doing it, Ethan," she said softly. "You're here." And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe that was enough. For now. The battle in his mind. In the days that followed, Ethan did everything he could to be present. He changed diapers. He helped with feedings. He took Amelia for walks around the neighborhood, feeling more at ease with her than he did anywhere else. But at night, the war still came back to haunt him. The nightmares were relentless. The images of bodies, the screams, the feeling of helplessness. It all felt too real. And every time he woke up gasping for air, he could see the worry in Sarah's eyes. "Ethan, you need to talk to someone," she said one morning as she handed him a cup of coffee. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't need therapy, Sarah." "Then what do you need?" she pressed. He didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. The breaking point. The final straw came on a quiet Saturday morning. Ethan was in the living room, bouncing Amelia in his arms while Sarah made breakfast. The TV was on in the background, just low enough to be ignored. And then, without warning, a loud explosion. Ethan's entire body locked up. His grip on Amelia tightened. His heartbeat roared in his ears. The sound wasn't real. It was a scene from a war documentary playing on TV. But his mind didn't know that. In an instant, he was back in the desert. The heat, the dust, the chaos. He could smell the burning wreckage. He could hear his men shouting for help. His hands began to shake. His breathing turned ragged. "Ethan." Sarah's voice broke through the haze. He blinked, realizing he was gripping Amelia too tightly. She wasn't crying. Thank God. But she was looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. Ethan's hands trembled as he handed her to Sarah. I need to step out, he muttered, turning toward the door. Sarah's heart clenched. Ethan, please, don't run from this. But he was already gone. The conversation that changed everything. Ethan didn't know how long he walked. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. All he knew was that his mind felt like a battlefield. By the time he reached the Veterans Center, his legs ached, his body was tense, and his thoughts were a tangled mess. He stepped inside and found Jackson sitting at a table, sipping coffee. The older soldier took one look at Ethan's face and sighed. Rough morning. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You could say that. Jackson gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. Ethan sat. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Jackson said, You ever hear about the two-wolf story? Ethan frowned. What? Jackson leaned back. An old Cherokee story. A man tells his grandson that inside every person there are 2 wolves fighting. One wolf is anger, fear, and self-destruction. The other is love, strength, and hope. Ethan exhaled sharply. And Jackson sipped his coffee. The grandson asks which wolf wins. The old man tells him, the one you feed. Ethan stared at him. Jackson shrugged. Right now, you're feeding the wrong wolf, Carter. You're letting guilt and fear eat you alive. But you got a kid now. A wife. It's time to start feeding the right one. Ethan swallowed. I don't know how, he admitted. Jackson set his coffee down. Then let someone teach you. Finally asking for help. That night, Ethan sat on the couch, hands clasped, staring at the floor. Sarah sat across from him, waiting. Finally, he spoke. I think I need help, he said. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. Okay, she whispered. We'll find someone. Ethan looked at her, his throat tightening. I don't want to be broken anymore. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. You're not broken, Ethan. You're just hurt, and we can fix that. For the first time, Ethan believed her. The first steps toward healing. Ethan started therapy the next week. It was uncomfortable. It was difficult, but it was necessary. He talked about the war, about the guilt, about the nights he spent wondering why he was still alive when others weren't. And slowly, painfully, he started to understand. He wasn't alone. He wasn't weak for feeling this way. And most importantly, he wasn't beyond saving. A moment of peace. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Amelia in his arms. The air was crisp, the stars bright. His daughter cooed softly, her tiny fingers grasping at his shirt. Ethan smiled down at her. I used to think I didn't belong here, he murmured. But maybe I was wrong. Amelia gurgled in response. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, I get it. I overthink too much. He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of peace. Not complete. Not yet. But for now, it was enough. Rebuilding a life worth living. A different kind of strength. Ethan Carter had always believed strength meant carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had spent years believing that if he faltered, if he showed weakness, people would suffer. That belief had kept him alive in war. But here, in the quiet life he had returned to, it was killing him. Strength wasn't about holding everything in. Strength was letting someone else hold you up when you couldn't stand on your own. And for the first time, he was ready to learn how. The struggle to heal. Therapy wasn't easy. Ethan had spent years keeping everything locked inside, and now he was being asked to lay it all out in the open. The first few sessions felt like torture. Talking about the war, about the guilt, about the men he had lost, it all felt like reopening wounds that had barely scabbed over. Why do you think you don't deserve happiness? His therapist, Dr. Lawson, asked one day. Ethan stared at the floor. Because I'm alive, he said finally. And they're not. Lawson nodded, jotting something down. Survivor's guilt is powerful, she said. But tell me this, if the roles were reversed, if one of your fallen brothers was sitting here instead of you, what would you tell them? Ethan clenched his fists. I'd tell them it wasn't their fault, he admitted. Lawson tilted her head. Then why can't you tell yourself that? Ethan had no answer. But that question stayed with him long after the session ended. The road back to his family. Sarah noticed the change in Ethan almost immediately. He wasn't healed, not yet, but he was trying. He was more present, more engaged. One evening, as he helped bathe Amelia, Sarah caught him smiling, really smiling, as their daughter splashed water everywhere. You're getting better, she said later, as they lay in bed. Ethan exhaled. I don't know if I'll ever be fixed. Sarah turned on her side, resting a hand on his chest. Maybe you don't need to be fixed, Evan. Maybe you just need to live. Her words stayed with him. Maybe he had spent too long trying to repair something that wasn't broken. Maybe healing wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about learning to live with it. Facing the past. One of the hardest steps in Ethan's journey came in the form of an old, wrinkled envelope. A letter. From the widow of one of his fallen soldiers. He had received it months ago, but never had the courage to open it. One evening, as Sarah rocked Amelia to sleep, he sat alone at the dining table, the letter in his shaking hands. He took a deep breath and tore it open. Dear Captain Carter, I hope this letter finds you well. I've wanted to write to you for a long time, but I wasn't sure what to say. I know you were with David when he died. I know he trusted you more than anyone. I just want you to know that I don't blame you. David made his choice. He was proud to serve, proud to fight alongside you. If he had to go, I know he wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else but beside his brothers. But I also know that you probably carry the weight of his loss, and I need you to hear this. He wouldn't want that. He wouldn't want you to live the rest of your life drowning in guilt. He used to talk about you, you know. Said you were one of the best leaders he ever had. He respected you. He followed you because he believed in you. So don't waste the life you still have, Captain. Live. Be happy. That's what he would have wanted. With gratitude. Emily Davis. Ethan's hands trembled as he set the letter down. For months, he had convinced himself that David's family must hate him, that they must blame him. But Emily's words were like a lifeline. She didn't blame him. David had made his choice. He had to accept that. He had to let go. Tears burned in his eyes as he folded the letter, pressing it against his chest. I'll live, David, he whispered. I promise. A new beginning. Months passed. The nightmares didn't disappear overnight. The memories didn't fade. But something shifted. Ethan no longer felt like he was drowning. He still had bad days. Days when the weight of the past threatened to pull him down. But now he had something to hold on to. His family. His future. Himself. The anniversary that changed everything. A year after Amelia was born, Ethan stood in their backyard, watching as Sarah played with their daughter in the grass. He smiled. This was his life now. Not war. Not death. Life. Sarah caught his gaze and walked over, slipping her arms around his waist. You okay? She asked. Ethan exhaled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Yeah, he said. I think I finally am. She grinned. Good. Because Amelia and I need you here. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. And for the first time, he believed it. Epilogue. The man he became. Years later, Ethan sat on the porch, watching Amelia chase fireflies in the twilight. She was older now, 5, with Sarah's bright eyes and his stubbornness. Daddy, look. She squealed, cupping a glowing firefly in her tiny hands. Ethan chuckled. That's amazing, sweetheart. She beamed, climbing into his lap. Mommy says you were a soldier, she said, studying his face. Ethan nodded. I was. Were you brave? He hesitated, then smiled. I tried to be, but you know what's even braver? She shook her head. Being a daddy. Amelia giggled. That's silly. Ethan kissed the top of her head, pulling her close. Maybe, he murmured, but it's the most important thing I've ever done. As the fireflies danced in the air and his daughter giggled in his arms, Ethan finally understood something. The war would always be a part of him. But it didn't define him. Not anymore. This, his family, his life, was his greatest victory. And he wouldn't trade it for anything. Finding peace, one step at a time. The journey of healing. Ethan Carter had always imagined that healing would be like flipping a switch. One day, he'd wake up, and the nightmares would be gone. The guilt would vanish. The weight on his chest would lift, and he would finally feel normal. But that wasn't how it worked. Healing wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small choices every day. It was deciding to get out of bed, even when the memories whispered that he didn't deserve happiness. It was choosing to be present with Sarah and Amelia, even when his mind wanted to retreat into the past. It was admitting that some days were harder than others, and learning to forgive himself for that. And slowly, painfully, he was learning to live again. A second chance at life. One evening, Ethan found himself sitting in the backyard, Amelia curled up in his lap. She had fallen asleep while he read to her tiny body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Sarah walked outside, watching them from the porch with a soft smile. She loves you so much, you know, she said. Ethan looked down at Amelia, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love her more than I thought I could love anything. Sarah walked over, sitting beside them. You're a good father, Ethan. He let out a small chuckle. I still don't know what I'm doing half the time. Sarah nudged him playfully. Nobody does. We just figure it out as we go. He sighed, leaning his head against hers. Thank you, Sarah. For what? For staying. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. That's what love is, Ethan. It's not just about the easy times. It's about standing by each other even when it's hard. He kissed her temple, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, he truly believed in the future. A step forward. The next day, Ethan made a decision. He had been visiting the Veterans Center for months, talking to Jackson, and attending therapy. But now he wanted to do more. He walked into the center and found Jackson at the usual table. Carter, Jackson greeted with a nod. What brings you in? Ethan sat down, exhaling deeply. I want to help. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Help how? Ethan hesitated, but then the words came easier than he expected. There are guys out there who feel the way I felt. Lost, angry, like they don't belong here anymore. And if I can help just one of them find their way back, then maybe all of this meant something. Jackson grinned. Well, Dan, Carter, took you long enough. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, guess I'm a slow learner. Jackson leaned forward. Serious now. You'll be good at this. And you know why? Because you've been in that dark place. You know what it's like to feel like there's no way out. And now you know there is. Ethan nodded. Yeah. And I want to help others find it too. That day, Ethan officially became a mentor at the center, helping other veterans who were struggling with the same demons he had faced. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't magic. But it was a step forward. And that was enough. The final battle. Forgiving himself. Months passed, and life found a rhythm. Ethan still had nightmares sometimes. He still had moments of doubt. But now he had the tools to fight back. One afternoon, he stood by David's grave. It had taken him over a year to visit, but he was finally here. He knelt, running a hand over the headstone. Hey, brother, he murmured. It took me a while to come. I wasn't ready before. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound in the cemetery. I blamed myself for so long, Ethan admitted. But I think I think I finally understand. You made your choice. You fought beside us because you wanted to. And if it had been me instead of you, I'd want you to live your life too. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I won't waste the life I have, David. I promise. And just like that, the weight in his chest felt lighter. For the first time, he allowed himself to let go. Not to forget. Never that. But to move forward. A life worth living. Years later, Ethan stood in his backyard, watching Amelia chase fireflies as the sun dipped below the horizon. She was 5 now. Bright, curious, and full of life. Sarah stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. "She's getting so big," she whispered. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand. "Yeah, and she's gonna do great things." Amelia ran up to them, grinning. "Daddy, Mommy, did you see? I caught one." Ethan crouched down, looking at the tiny firefly glowing in her hands. "That's amazing, sweetheart." She looked up at him, her big, innocent eyes studying his face. "Mommy says you were a soldier," she said. Ethan nodded. "I was." "Were you scared?" He exhaled, considering his answer. "Yeah, sweetheart. Sometimes I was." Amelia tilted her head. "But you're brave now, right?" Ethan smiled. "I think being brave means being scared, but choosing to keep going anyway." She thought about that for a moment, then beamed. "Then you're the bravest person ever." Sarah laughed, wrapping an arm around Ethan's waist. Ethan chuckled, pulling his daughter into his arms. "I don't know about that, kiddo. But I do know one thing." "What?" Amelia asked, wide-eyed. He looked at Sarah, then back at Amelia. "This is the best thing I've ever done." As the fireflies danced in the twilight and laughter filled the air, Ethan realized something. He had spent so long surviving. Now he was finally living. And that was the greatest victory of all.